virtually negative, virtually nil. And in fact, and it drove me crazy, they didn't notify the Department of Social Services. So if they placed child A into Roanoke County, Virginia, they didn't notify the Department of Social Services in Roanoke County, Virginia, that child A was coming there. They didn't notify the school system. I would have accepted either one. So the schools didn't know to look for these people, these children, and the social services didn't know that there was somebody to check on. They weren't doing background checks on the people at all. We're not even talking about, anything that would be considered standard for a child in the United States of America. And I said at the time, and I'll say it today, Madam Chair, and I want to know if you agree with me or not, Mr. Fry. I may not agree on how that child came into the custody of the United States of America, may not agree that they're here. But once we take custody of that child, we have an obligation to protect that child. Would you agree with that?
Listen to what you just heard, and let it sink deep into your bones, because we're about to pull back the curtain on a systemic catastrophe that reveals everything wrong with how we approach governance when human lives hang in the balance, versus when we just want to perform cruelty for political points. The gentleman in this clip is describing something so fundamentally broken, so appallingly negligent, that it should shake every single person who hears it to their absolute core. And here's the thing that's going to make your blood boil, before we even get into the grotesque political weaponization of these vulnerable children. From January 2021 to January 2025, 11,488 migrant children were placed with unvetted sponsors who were not their parent or legal guardian, and who were not fingerprinted or did not receive a background check. And the Biden-Harris administration did not conduct home studies for 79,143 migrant children under the age of 12, including 1,961 children who were placed in households where a home study was recommended. These aren't just numbers on a page. These are children, actual human beings with beating hearts and dreams and fears, children who fled violence and poverty so extreme that their families sent them on a journey that could kill them because staying was worse. And when they arrived here seeking protection, the richest nation on earth couldn't be bothered to do the absolute bare minimum to keep them safe. But wait, because here's where this story transforms from tragedy into something far more sinister, and we need to understand the full architecture of this failure before the right-wing propaganda machine twists it into something unrecognizable. HHS frequently placed migrant children in rundown apartment complexes and dilapidated motels with barred windows, appliances stacked on patios and apartments with no doors or kitchens, with local police noting many of these properties were located in areas with high violent crime rates, daily shootings and gang activity, and multiple DHS offices confirmed HHS released children to incomplete or commercial addresses, with ICE officials at one field office noting the Biden HHS released 34 children to 2 addresses that didn't exist. Let that image crystallize in your mind. Children sent to addresses that literally do not exist, placed in conditions that would constitute criminal neglect if we were talking about American citizens, and the system that was supposed to protect them was essentially running a conveyor belt from the border directly into exploitation. Now here comes the bombshell that should make every progressive activist understand why this issue demands our fiercest moral attention, even as conservatives try to hijack it for their xenophobic agenda. The Biden-Harris administration released dozens of UACs to the same sponsor, with the administration sending more than 100 children to the same address in Austin, Texas, while other Texas addresses received 44 and 25 minors respectively. 100 children to the same address. This isn't bureaucratic inefficiency. This is a red flashing alarm that was ignored because the political imperative was speed over safety, optics over actual child welfare, and here's where we need to get absolutely clear about what happened, because the discourse around this has been polluted by bad faith actors who want to use these children's suffering to justify mass deportation and border militarization, when the actual problem is that our immigration system treats human beings like widgets to be processed rather than vulnerable people who need protection. The congressman in that clip said something profoundly important that gets lost in all the shouting, that once we take custody of a child we have an obligation to protect that child, and this is where progressive values and basic human decency converge into an undeniable moral imperative. The Biden-Harris administration limited HHS employees' communication with law enforcement, and HHS failed to provide DHS law enforcement officers with accurate or timely information regarding the status and safety of migrant children. Think about what this means in practical terms. When red flags emerged about potential trafficking or abuse, the system was designed to prevent the very communication that could have saved children from predators. Because the administration was so terrified of being accused of collaboration with ICE, that they built walls between agencies that needed to coordinate to protect vulnerable minors. And now we have to confront the most disturbing revelations because they expose how capitalist exploitation feeds on the most vulnerable, and our government essentially became a labor trafficking pipeline. Data obtained by The Times showed that over the last 2 years, the agency could not reach more than 85,000 children. Migrant children, often expected to earn their keep and send money home, were working long hours on construction sites and in factories, slaughterhouses, and commercial laundromats, some of whom suffered serious injuries or died on the job. Children died. They died working jobs that American corporations profited from while our government looked the other way, and here's where the New York Times investigation that Dreyer conducted becomes absolutely crucial because she documents this shadow workforce extending across industries in every state, flouting child labor laws that have been in place for nearly a century. We need to pause here and understand the economic forces at play, because this isn't just about immigration policy. This is about how late-stage capitalism creates demand for exploitable labor, and then our broken immigration system supplies that demand with children who have zero legal protections and nowhere to turn. ROR has come under increased scrutiny in the wake of reports that child labor exploitation is on the rise, including a Labor Department investigation that found more than 100 children, many of them unaccompanied minors from Guatemala, were employed cleaning Midwestern slaughterhouses, with labor officials saying since 2018 there has been a 69% increase in the number of children employed in violation of labor laws. 69% increase. This is happening on American soil in 2024, while we pretend we're a civilized nation that banned child labor a century ago, except we didn't ban it for children who are undocumented because their legal status makes them invisible to the systems that are supposed to protect all children. Now let's talk about the political response, because this is where the story gets even more infuriating and reveals the fundamental bankruptcy of how both parties have approached immigration. According to a Florida grand jury investigation, in one memorable instance, a federal employee was told by an ORR attorney to stop asking questions about potentially unsafe sponsors because doing so caused delay, saying we only get sued for keeping them too long. We don't get sued by traffickers. Are we clear? Read that again slowly because this is the smoking gun that proves the administration prioritized avoiding detention lawsuits over preventing trafficking, and this is what happens when progressives get so focused on one dimension of child welfare, keeping kids out of detention facilities, that we lose sight of the broader obligation to ensure they're actually safe wherever they end up. Here's the part that's going to make you want to scream, because conservatives are now weaponizing this failure to justify exactly the wrong solutions. The right-wing narrative machine has seized on these horrifying statistics to push for more border militarization, more deportations, more cruelty, but Republicans began making claims that more than 305,000 unaccompanied children had been lost after the Department of Homeland Security released a report in August, which showed that Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, did not serve notices to appear in court to 291,000 children between fiscal year 2019 and May 2024, with an additional 32,019 and May 2024, with an additional 32,000 unaccompanied children failing to show up for immigration court dates from fiscal year 2019 to 2023, notably around half of this period occurring when Trump was president. So first of all, the 300,000 missing children narrative is deliberately misleading because, while the DHS report stated that children who do not attend their court hearings can be at a higher risk of being trafficked or exploited, it did not say that the total 323,000 children referenced are unaccounted for or missing. But here's where we need to be absolutely rigorous about distinguishing between the exaggerated claims and the very real failures, because both things can be true simultaneously. Trump can be lying about the scale while Biden genuinely failed these children catastrophically. While the vast majority of the UAC's missing court hearings or not receiving an NTA are in fact safe with sponsors, the OIG report was correct in highlighting shortcomings in the system, going into considerable detail, identifying many of these shortcomings, including ICE's failure to use automated processes to share information, the absence of formal policies or processes requiring the continued tracking and monitoring of UACs placed with sponsors, and resource limitations, all as contributing factors to these problems. So most of these kids are probably fine, living with family members and going to school and building lives, but some significant number are being exploited and trafficked, and we don't actually know how many, because the system was designed not to know. And this brings us to the deeper structural critique that progressives need to be making loudly and clearly, because this catastrophe reveals how our entire approach to immigration is built on contradictions that guarantee failure and suffering. We have this fundamentally incoherent system where we simultaneously refuse to admit that we need immigrant labor, create economic demand for exploitable workers, make legal immigration nearly impossible, criminalize people for crossing borders while doing nothing to actually secure those borders effectively, and then act shocked when vulnerable children get caught in the machinery and ground up. The number of unaccompanied minors entering the United States climbed to a high of 130,000 last year, 3 times what it was 5 years earlier, and these are not children who have stolen into the country undetected because the federal government knows they are in the United States, and the Department of Health and Human Services is responsible for ensuring sponsors will support them and protect them from trafficking or exploitation. But as more and more children have arrived, the Biden White House ramped up demands on staffers to move the children quickly out of shelters and release them without adequate safeguards. Here's the memo that should make every single person understand the systemic rot at the heart of this. Concerns piled up in summer 2021 at the Office of Refugee Resettlement, the HHS division responsible for unaccompanied migrant children, with a memo that July from 11 managers saying they were worried that labor trafficking was increasing and complaining to their bosses that the office had become one that rewards individuals for making quick releases, and not one that rewards individuals for preventing unsafe releases. The people on the ground, the ones actually doing the work, were sounding the alarm in 2021, and they were ignored because the political pressure was all in one direction. Get those kids out of facilities where cameras can see them, and into the invisible economy where whatever happens to them won't create bad headlines. Now let's talk about the class dimension here, because this is absolutely a story about how capitalism devours the vulnerable and spits out profit. Ori examined a subset of more than 34,000 children who were released to distant relatives or non-relative sponsors and analyzed the vetting of sponsors for the 344 children who were placed with sponsors hosting 3 or more unaccompanied kids, with immigrant advocates saying sponsors of this kind could be a red flag for child labor trafficking. When one person is sponsoring multiple unrelated children, that's not compassion, that's a business model, and the business is exploiting child labor because children are cheaper, more compliant, less likely to know their rights, and if they're undocumented, they literally cannot go to authorities without risking deportation. And here's what makes this entire catastrophe even more enraging. We have these massive corporations, household names that every American knows, who were absolutely benefiting from this child labor, and they knew or should have known. Children were overlooked by auditors who were moving quickly, leaving early or simply not sent to the part of the supply chain where minors were working. The Times found in audits performed at 20 production facilities used by some of the nation's most recognizable brands. The auditing system that was supposed to prevent this was a joke, a rubber stamp, security theater designed to create plausible deniability for corporations who absolutely did not want to look too closely at where their cheap labor was coming from, because willful ignorance is profitable. So what do we do with this information? Because the easy thing would be to just let conservatives use it to justify mass deportations and closed borders, but that would compound the cruelty and solve nothing. The hard thing, the thing that requires actual moral courage and policy sophistication, is to acknowledge that Biden and his administration failed these children badly, while also insisting that the solution is more protection, not less immigration. The safety and well-being of children are of paramount concern, and the speed of their release from ORR care should never take precedence over these goals, with exploitation in its various forms being most likely to occur or continue when an individual is isolated from support or confronted by systemic barriers in accessing assistance, which is especially true for unaccompanied children as an inherently vulnerable population. What we needed and still need is a system that actually treats these children as children, that provides legal representation so they can navigate immigration court, that conducts thorough vetting of sponsors including home visits and ongoing monitoring, that coordinates between agencies to identify and prevent trafficking, that goes after the employers who create demand for child labor with real criminal penalties, not just fines that become cost of doing business, that provides support services so children aren't economically compelled to work in dangerous jobs to survive, and that ultimately creates legal pathways for people to immigrate so they're not forced into these desperate circumstances in the first place. But here's the absolutely maddening part about the current political moment and why this clip is circulating now. Conservatives are acting like they discovered this problem, and they're the ones who care about these children when around half of this period occurred when Trump was president, and his administration was absolutely no better at tracking these kids or protecting them. But more importantly, the Trump administration took significant steps indicating that UACs and their sponsors would be targets for deportations, with ICE issuing a memo on February 23 directing agency personnel to conduct a nationwide search for unaccompanied minors for deportation purposes, indicating it would be placing UACs into 3 categories: flight risk, public safety, and border security, with a special focus on those identified as flight risks, highlighting UACs who were issued deportation orders after missing court appearances or those with non-blood relative sponsors. So Trump's solution to children being exploited is to deport them, which is both morally bankrupt and practically useless because it does nothing to address the economic conditions in Central America that drive migration or the labor demand in the United States that creates the market for exploitation. And it certainly doesn't help the children who are literally being raped and trafficked right now. HSI Austin reported the identification and rescue of a child, the arrest of 2 Guatemalan nationals for violation of immigration law, and the initiation of an HSI-led investigation of state and federal charges of human trafficking and statutory rape, with agents during a welfare check identifying a pregnant 14-year-old female residing with an unrelated adult male sponsor, later determined to be the biological father of the unborn child. A pregnant 14-year-old. This is the reality we're talking about, not abstract policy debates, but actual children being sexually assaulted by the adults who were supposed to care for them, and the system failed so completely that this was able to happen on American soil under government supervision. And let's be absolutely clear about why this happened, because it wasn't random bureaucratic incompetence. It was the predictable result of policy choices driven by competing political pressures that treated children as problems to be managed rather than human beings to be protected. Progressives wanted kids out of detention because detention is traumatic, and those images of kids in cages were political poison, so there was enormous pressure to release children quickly. Immigration restrictionists wanted to make the process so miserable that it would deter future migration, so they opposed adequate funding for care and services. Corporate interests wanted cheap exploitable labor, and they have tremendous political influence, so they opposed robust enforcement of labor laws and employer sanctions. And everyone agreed, implicitly or explicitly, that undocumented immigrants, especially children, don't deserve the same protections as citizens, so when corners got cut, nobody with power cared enough to stop it. This is what systemic failure looks like, and it implicates not just the Biden administration, but Congress and federal courts and state governments, and all of us collectively for allowing our immigration system to remain this broken for this long. Under the Biden administration, OR dramatically weakened its oversight of unaccompanied children, putting them at risk of exploitation, with the final rule codifying inadequate sponsor vetting requirements, which means Biden actually made the problem worse by institutionalizing lax standards through formal rulemaking, essentially locking in the failures that led to children being trafficked. And here's the part that should radicalize everyone who cares about children or immigration or labor rights or human dignity, because all of those things intersect in this catastrophe. In fiscal years 2023 and 2024, HHS released more than 24,100 migrant children to unrelated sponsors or distant relatives, with law enforcement officers noting these children are at the highest risk for trafficking. 24,000 children in just 2 years sent to the highest risk situations, while everyone involved knew or should have known what was likely to happen to at least some of them. And nobody stopped it, because stopping it would have required political courage and bureaucratic competence, and adequate funding and interagency coordination, and all the things our system is terrible at providing, when the people who need protection have no political power. So when you hear conservatives weaponizing this issue to push for mass deportations and border walls, and all their usual xenophobic nonsense, understand that they're exploiting these children's suffering just as surely as the factories and slaughterhouses exploited their labor, because the solution to government failure to protect vulnerable children is not to make those children more vulnerable by eliminating their access to protection entirely, it's to actually provide the protection we're legally and morally obligated to provide. HHS launched an interagency initiative in February 2025 to identify and address suspected fraud, exploitation, and trafficking in the program, specifically facilitating coordination between HHS employees, other federal agencies, and law enforcement, allowing potential trafficking and criminal activities to be referred to the appropriate investigative body, with Grassley having exposed the Biden administration for barring HHS employees from communicating with law enforcement, which was verified in a bombshell report earlier this year. So there is a path forward, there are reforms that could work, but they require resources and political will, and a fundamental reorientation toward treating immigrant children as children first who deserve protection, rather than as immigration problems to be solved through deterrence and neglect. We need mandatory home studies before placement, ongoing welfare checks with teeth behind them, legal representation for every child navigating immigration proceedings, serious criminal penalties for employers who exploit child labor, whistleblower protections for people who report abuse, interagency data sharing, so red flags actually get noticed and acted on, and adequate funding so caseworkers aren't so overwhelmed that they rubber stamp placements just to clear their desks. But more fundamentally, we need to acknowledge that this catastrophe is the inevitable result of treating immigration as a law enforcement problem rather than a humanitarian reality, and an economic phenomenon that requires comprehensive solutions. As long as we maintain this fiction that we can just seal the border and make immigration go away, we guarantee that vulnerable people, including children, will continue to fall through the cracks and be exploited by systems that profit from their vulnerability and legal precarity. These kids come here with the express purpose of working so they can send money back to desperate families back home who cannot survive without their support. But what these kids don't realize is how expensive it is just to pay for rent and food in the United States, and from what we know, many of these kids have to support themselves once they get here. So these children are trapped in an impossible situation, fleeing violence and poverty so extreme that the dangerous journey north seems like the better option, arriving in a country that simultaneously needs their labor and criminalizes their existence, placed with sponsors who may be family or may be strangers or may be traffickers, but either way the children have no real support or protection, and then forced to work brutal, dangerous jobs to survive, because there's no social safety net for undocumented kids and no legal way for them to exist here without working, and no enforcement mechanism to ensure the work they do is safe or age-appropriate or even legal. This is how America treats the most vulnerable children who arrive seeking protection in 2024, and we should all be ashamed, but more importantly, we should all be furious, and that fury should translate into political action that demands comprehensive immigration reform that actually protects human beings. The congressman in that clip was right. Once we take custody of a child, we have an obligation to protect that child, regardless of how that child got here, or what we think about immigration policy more broadly, and we failed that obligation catastrophically. 75,000 children whose whereabouts and safety status are unknown, thousands working in dangerous jobs, hundreds trafficked for sex or labor, some raped, some killed, all of this happening not in spite of government oversight, but because of government failure to provide the oversight that was legally required and morally imperative. This isn't just an immigration story, or a child welfare story. It's a story about how our entire system is designed to grind up the powerless, to extract profit, and then blame them for being ground up, and until we confront that fundamental reality and build something different, something that actually treats human dignity as non-negotiable and child safety as paramount, we're going to keep seeing these catastrophes repeat with minor variations, but the same underlying mechanics of exploitation and neglect. So yes, be angry about what Biden's HHS did and failed to do, but channel that anger toward building systems that actually protect vulnerable children, rather than letting conservatives weaponize your anger to justify even greater cruelty. Demand accountability for the failures that led to children being trafficked on government watch, but also demand the resources and reforms and comprehensive solutions that could prevent it from happening again, and reject entirely the false choice between protecting immigrant children and enforcing immigration law, because those things are not in tension if your goal is actually child safety rather than immigration restriction for its own sake. These children deserved better. They deserve better right now, and we have the capacity as a wealthy nation to provide better if we can muster the political will to treat their lives as mattering as much as the lives of children who happen to be born on this side of an arbitrary line on a map.